Welcome, everyone, to the Ontology Summit 2026. Today is the 15th of April, 2026, and this is the last session in the Foundations and Tools track of the summit. And today, we are thrilled to have a long-time participant and chair of many meetings on the Ontolog Forum and the Ontology Summit, Nicola Guarino was the keynote speaker last year at the Ontology Summit 2025, has been chair of the summit in 2011, 2012, and today he is going to be speaking within the Ontology Summit 2026. Nicola is, as you can see, retired research associate at the Institute for Cognitive Sciences and Technologies, Laboratory for Applied Ontology in Trento, Italy. He's been a leading person on our field. He has developed a strong interdisciplinary approach that combines together computer science, philosophy, and linguistics. He's perhaps best known for OntoClean and the Dolce foundational ontology. And he's been editor-in-chief as well as founder of the Applied Ontology Journal, founder and former president of IAOA. He's an ER fellow of the European Association for Artificial Intelligence, and has received the Peter P. Chen Award for outstanding contributions to the field of conceptual modeling. So today, I'd like to welcome Nicola, who's going to be speaking on ontological analysis as a search for truthmakers.
Thank you, Ken. It's a real pleasure to be here to celebrate with you the 20th anniversary of this noble tradition at the Ontology Summit. Today I'm going to revisit some of the old work we did with Giancarlo Guizzardi, with also some new stuff. Let me start from a picture many of you have seen already, which shows how ontologies are attempted to capture the conceptualizations which are in the mind of people. And the main focus of the discussion today will be the notion of ontological commitment, in particular the fact that when you decide to use a formal language to talk about conceptualization, the first choice you have to make is the choice concerning the domain of discourse and the vocabulary. The domain of discourse, D prime, is in general a subset of the set of things which are relevant from the cognitive point of view. D is the cognitive domain. D prime is the actual domain we decide to use in our ontology, the so-called domain of discourse. And similarly, R prime is the vocabulary you are going to adopt, which is definitely a subset of all possible relevant properties and relations which are in your conceptualization. So the design problem for an ontology, the first design problem we have to face is deciding what to put in the domain of discourse and what to put in our vocabulary. And we shall see that how formal ontological considerations can help in this decision. And we also will see that basically choosing the domain and choosing the vocabulary are things which are not independent one each other. So I see ontological analysis as a search for so-called truth makers. So the question, as I said, is what to include in our ontology, more exactly in the domain of discourse. Well, the answer is include those entities that are responsible for the truth of your relevant propositions. So basically, ontological analysis can be seen as a search of these hidden entities, which are the truth makers, which are responsible for the truth of our propositions. Like a detective with a lens, we have to look for these truth makers. For instance, the questions, the relevant questions we ask ourselves in this endeavor are something like that. What makes our statements about the world true? Or put in a different way, how do we believe the world is when we use certain propositions? For instance, if you say John is married with Mary, what is that makes this statement true? Well, presumably it is an event which happened some time ago, okay? A marriage, it is the existence of that event which is responsible for the truth of the proposition that John is married with Mary. Similarly, when I say the rose is red, you can wonder what is indeed which makes truth this thing, this proposition. Okay, it is a fact that the rose is red, maybe an event of redness, maybe a quality, the color is of the rose and not the weight of the rose is responsible for the fact that it is red. When I say my name is Nicola, okay, what is the reason why this is true? Okay, well, it depends on something which happened many, many years ago when my parents decided to give this name to me. So ontological analysis is all about making these truth makers explicit, understanding why propositions are true. And this means once you find the truth maker, you reify them by putting them in the domain of discourse. This is the general process of reification, which is a standard process in conceptual modeling and ontology modeling. So what are truth makers more exactly? There are, of course, various positions in philosophy. The standard view is that the truth maker of a proposition phi is a suitable entity in virtue of which phi holds. This is the general statement, the general position. Of course, the point is understanding exactly what's the meaning of in virtue of. A trivial answer could be that phi holds in virtue of the fact that phi is true. This is not very informative, in my opinion. Okay, simply it establishes the value of this position is that it establishes a correspondence between the language, okay, the proposition, which is an element of the language, and something in the world, the fact that phi. But a more informative, more interesting answer is that phi holds in virtue of the existence of something, of a certain X. Okay, so you find something whose existence is responsible for the truth of the proposition. This thing is not a fact because facts do not exist. The fact either hold or not. Okay. So looking for the existence of something is not looking for a fact. It is looking for some entity in the domain of discourse. Now, depending on the nature of this phi, you have several possibilities. If phi is contingent, so not a necessary proposition, we assume that the truth makers are events, okay? This is obvious, for instance, if phi a proposition involving an historical property. I am a father, okay? Okay, being a father is an historical property. I'm a father because something existed some time ago. Okay, my name is Nicola, the same. Okay, so for historical properties, it seems kind of obvious that the truth makers are events, indeed, typically past events. And we shall see the nature of truth makers for other kinds of properties, not only historical properties. But before that, let me clarify that no clear agreement exists in philosophy concerning the truth makers of necessary propositions. Indeed, my choice is simply that necessary statements do not need truth makers. They hold anyway. Okay, so there is nothing nothing that is requires to exist in order for them to hold. Okay, they hold. That's it. So the interesting propositions for the point of view of analyzing the truth makers are the contingent propositions, not the necessary propositions. So summing up, according to this view, which I will label for the reasons which will be clear in a second, I will label this position strong truth making. Okay, strong truth makers are such that their mere existence entails the proposition's truth. Okay, this is the standard view on truth making. There is this existence entails the truth. As usual, there are problems for this view. First of all, there are two important assumptions we characterize this position. The first one is so-called truth-maker essentialism, according to which the truth, if T is a truth maker of phi at a certain world, then it must be a truth maker of the same proposition in all possible worlds. So truth makers are essentially such that the propositions are true. This is pretty plausible, okay? More debatable is the assumption of so-called maximalism, which says that every true sentence must have a truth maker. Okay, this would be nice in principle, but there are a number of technical problems for, as we have seen, necessary propositions. Okay, so what are the truth makers of necessary propositions? Not clear, and especially there are problems with the negation of properties, disjunctions, and so on. So we shall adopt a more modest position, which is due to a philosopher which I will keep mentioning later on, Josh Parsons. And the position is the following: the best we can demand is that every contingent truth either has a truth maker, or it is the conjunction, disjunction, negation of some other or some other more complicated Boolean combinations of propositions that would have truth makers where they are true. So basically, it is enough to concentrate on truth makers of simple propositions. Not let us complicate our mind with the arbitrary compositions of simple propositions. In particular, from the application point of view, from the practical point of view, there is an interesting case for so-called descriptive properties, which will be the main focus of the rest of the presentation. The descriptive properties hold in virtue of how their arguments are. If X is red, okay, X, this holds in virtue of how X is, okay? How is it red, X? Well, it is red, okay? Descriptive properties have events as strong truth makers. Okay, so the redness, the particular event, or more exactly, the state of redness, is the truth maker of these descriptive properties. Non-descriptive properties hold in virtue of what the arguments are, not how the arguments are, but what the arguments are. For instance, X is an apple, X is a person, X is father, okay, is a father. Most of these non-descriptive properties are rigid in the sense that they necessarily hold for all their instances. Okay, as we have seen, if they are rigid, then it is not necessary to find truth makers for them. Okay, if they are not rigid, they still have events as strong truth makers. But we shall give more attention to descriptive properties in the rest of the talk. For descriptive properties, indeed, I said that they have events as truth makers, the particular redness event, or the particular redness state for the rose, for instance. Some philosophers say that indeed the truth makers of descriptive properties are so-called tropes, which are particularized properties. But I see tropes as events, more exactly states. So I really don't make a distinction between tropes and events. But this is an aside. We can ignore tropes for the time being. The interesting thing with the descriptive properties is that for them, there is a second option, a different way of thinking of their truth makers. And I will label this second kind of truth makers weak truth makers. So there are strong truth makers and weak truth makers. As I said, strong truth making is related to the mere existence of something. Okay, it is the mere existence of something which is responsible for the truth of the proposition. So the proposition holds in virtue of whether something exists in any possible world. Okay, the point is finding something whose existence is responsible for the truth of the proposition. Weak truth making, according to weak truth making, a proposition holds in virtue of the way something is, not in virtue of whether this guy exists, but in virtue of the way it is. Consider, for instance, a particular rose. We call it rosy. Rosy is red at time t1. Rosy becomes brown at time t2. According to the standard view, there are two different truth makers for these propositions at different times, because of course there are two different states. The state of being red at a certain time is very different from the state of being brown at another time. So two different truth makers. One single truth maker, according to the weak, according to the second view, the weak truth making. The weak truth maker is the rose itself. Is the rose itself, which is responsible for being red at a certain time and being brown at another time. It is in virtue of how the rose is that we decide whether the rose is red or is brown. Okay, the way rosy is responsible for the truth of the proposition. This seems a little bit trivial when we consider just this very simple example. But things become more interesting when we look at the so-called minimal truth makers. But before that, let me clarify more exactly what is this new criterion for weak truth making. The statement is the following, the definition is the following. For every true sentence, there is something such that the sentence cannot become false without a qualitative change in that thing, okay? That thing, whatever it is the sentence truth maker. So the sentence, the rose is red, cannot become false without a qualitative change in the rose, of course. But more in general, the sentence cannot become false without a qualitative change, more exactly in the corolla of the rose. The minimal weak truth maker for this rose is red is the corolla, or more exactly the color of the corolla. It is not the stem which is responsible for the truth of the proposition. It is not the weight of the rose which is responsible for this proposition, but it is the color of the corolla. Okay, first there is a particular part, the corolla, and this part has a quality, which is the color. The color of the corolla is the minimal weak truth maker. So all the rose, the corolla, and the color of the corolla are all truth makers. The corolla color is the minimal one. So summing up, the proposition this rose is red cannot become false without a change in a particular individual quality, which is the color of the corolla of the rose. Because what are individual qualities? Well, both Dolce, Baffo, UFO assume these entities in their ontology, so I will not talk much about them. Anyway, qualities are individual quality are specific aspects of things we use to compare them. They are comparable, while objects and events can only be compared with respect to a quality kind. So I have problems reading my own slides because they are covered anyway. Qualities inhere in specific individuals. This means that they are existentially dependent on such individuals. So the color of the rose is existentially dependent on the rose itself. And these qualities are distinct from their values, also called qualia, which are abstract entities representing what exactly resembling individual qualities have in common. And they are organized in quality spaces and so on. But anyway, this is, I guess many of you are familiar with the individual qualities already. An important terminological clarification is that properties hold while qualities exist. So, once you realize that qualities are minimal weak truth makers, you get a particular result from the practical point of view. In particular, the explanatory power of your ontology becomes higher. Compare, for instance, this statement: the rose is red because of its redness. Not very informative. The rose is red because of its color. Oh, wow. Okay. In this case, the sentence refers to a particular aspect of the rose, that is responsible for the truth of the sentence, among many others that are irrelevant. So in a sense, this contributes to explain the nature of the red predication, okay? Red is associated to color, okay? This is something which is not clear in the previous case, okay? Besides qualities, there is another thing which is another category which is introduced in particular in the UFO ontology, the category of modes. Modes are generalizations of qualities, so to speak. For instance, John's headache is a mode according to the UFO ontology. Similarly, John's love for Mary is also a mode, okay? It is a relational mode. John's love for Mary is something which inheres in John, but of course depends on Mary. Okay. So in general, we shall consider both individual qualities and modes as weak truth makers. By the way, this is the position of modes in the UFO ontology. Both modes and qualities are aspects. There is another kind of aspect, relator, which I will mention later on. Not all, so we have seen that individual qualities and modes can be weak truth makers for descriptive properties. Also parts can be weak truth makers. For instance, this is a statue of Socrates, and consider the sentence, Socrates is snub-nosed, okay? What is the minimal weak truth maker? Oh, well, it seems to be the nose itself. In real time, more exactly, there is a more minimal truth maker, which is the shape of the nose. Okay, so the nose is a weak truth maker. It's not minimal. Okay, the minimal one is the shape of the nose, but the nose is genuinely a weak truth maker as well. So Socrates, because of the way it is, the way he is a truth maker. The nose, because of the way it is a truth maker. The shape of the nose is the minimal truth maker. Finally, I will briefly introduce some, on the basis of this analysis, we, from the point of view of actual, from the point of view of the modeling choices for ontologies, it is useful to consider several kinds of truth-making patterns. And Giancarlo and I have adopted a systematic approach for these truth-making patterns. Properties and their truth makers, relations and their truth makers. There are patterns for properties and patterns for relations. And the idea of truth-making patterns is the consequence that both strong and weak truth makers are useful for different reasons. Okay, so it is not that weak truth makers substitute the notion of strong truth maker. They are both useful. Let us start with the most simple choice we can have while modeling, while dealing with the rose. Okay, we can have just an attribute, which is the color. Okay, there is a class, which is a kind in Onto UML. Okay, there is a class with just an attribute color. A more explicit choice is to put the truth maker explicit as a quality which inheres in the rose. Okay, so these are two different modeling choices. Also, we can also give a role to the strong truth maker, which will be a particular color occurrence, okay? The rose participates in a particular color occurrence. And these two things can be put together, these two different kinds of truth makers can be put together in a more complete model, okay? So there is the rose, there is a quality which is in quality color which is inherent in the rose, and the rose participates to a particular color occurrence whose focus, this color occurrence, this event has a focus which is the color. So basically you see three different truth-making patterns. The simple one with only the color, the other one with the color occurrence, and the more complete one which has both, reifies both the strong truth makers and the weak truth makers. Indeed, this process, getting from a more compact representation to a more explicit representation, has been called unpacking by Giancarlo and myself. It's a kind of, so making truth makers explicit is at the bottom of this unpacking process. While doing so, you gradually come up with a more explanatory ontology or conceptual model, if you like. So far, I've been talking of truth makers for properties, or more exactly for propositions involving a particular property, because truth makers are for propositions, but sometimes for the easier speaking, I collapse the truth makers for a I say that there is a truth maker for a property, intending the truth maker for the propositions involving that property. Anyway, concerning relations, sometimes we must talk of relationships. What are relationships? Is actually you can see of it as the occurrence of a relation, or more exactly as the truth maker of a relation. Is what makes it true that the relation holds. Okay. Sorry. Reifying these truth makers, the truth makers for a relation, allows us to talk of the nature of the relationship, the way it changes in time, and the interaction with the world. So we distinguish, there is a careful distinction between a relation, which is a mathematical notion, and relationship, which is an ontological notion. Okay, when you want to talk, there is a couple, they want to talk of they're not talking of their relation, they're talking of their relationship, the way the relation occurs in the world. And this is a truth maker. And we shall see in a second more exactly the nature of this truth maker. Indeed, relationships as truth makers of relations are sums, merological sums of qualities. Here is the picture of John and Mary, okay? Suppose we say that John is in love with Mary, okay? This is the relation. The relationship is the merological sum of John's love for Mary plus Mary's love for John. Okay, these are aspects, these are modes inhering in John. There is a mode inhering in John. There is another mode inhering in Mary. We take the sum of this, and this is the truth maker. This is what makes it true that indeed John and Mary are in love. Sorry, are in love with each other. Sorry. Similarly, if we say that John is taller than Mary, slightly taller than Mary in the picture, okay, This means that we have to talk of the height of Mary and the height of John. Okay, these are two qualities. You take the sum of the two qualities, and this is the truth maker of the relation. This sum of modes are called relators in the UFO ontology, and indeed they are a key construct in the OntoUML language. Okay, from the more, let me show you some other patterns, truth-making patterns for other kinds of relations. We have seen the case of the taller than relation. If you have heavier than similar stuff, you can model it this way. Okay, there is a weight, which is a quality inherent in the object. The the relator is the sum of the two qualities. So you see that the weight relationship, which is the relator, has two parts, which are the two weights. And the relator involves, has two relata, which are the two objects. Okay, that's why the cardinality 2 in this model. If you want to take into account also the strong truth maker, you put the weight and balance event in the picture. This is another example of a simple model for a historical relation born in. Okay. In this case, there is only the strong truth maker, the event, because the relation is not a descriptive relation. So only the truth maker plays the strong truth maker plays a role here. Finally, consider a more complex relation, married with. Okay, comparative relations, simply loving relations are, in a sense, less complicated. But as a matter of fact, as we know, the marriage relation is more complicated. Suppose that John is married with Mary. Okay, well, there are several relational properties, relational modes inhering in John, inhering in Mary, okay? Typically consisting of mutual commitments and obligations with respect to the other partner, helping each other, caring the children, and so on, okay? So all these commitments are reified, are represented in UFO as relational modes inhering in the arguments. But the point is that there are many of them. An actual marriage relationship typically presupposes many of such commitments, and none of them alone is a truth maker, okay? Because it is not enough to make the actual relation true. So in this case, the truth maker is the maximal mereological sum of all commitments which are necessary for the relation to hold. This is this is a relator. So you see how the notion of relator is pretty powerful, and it is based on this commitment to truth makers. Okay, so these mereological sums are called relators in the UFO ontology. I'm going to the conclusions. I skip this. I give you an example, another example of a very complex relation, a contractual relation. So the actual relationship is the relator, which involves the provider and the customer. And the relator is composed, its parts are claims and commitments. And if you want to model the evolution of contract in time, there is you just put an event, which is a strong truth maker, whose focus is the contractual relationship, which is a relator. So you see how things may get complicated, but the important point is that you make all the important things explicit, and you can easily focus the attention on one or another. Okay, I'm almost completed my talk. Just one general consideration from the philosophical point of view. According to Quine, the commitment of a logical theory is just its domain of discourse. The important thing is to decide what you have, what are the things you quantify on. But the search for truth makers forces us to look also at the predicates, not just the entities in the domain. And indeed, according to Armstrong, who wrote a book on truthmaking, he says that the great advantage for the search of truth makers is that it focuses us not merely on the metaphysical implications of the subject terms of propositions, so not just the subjects, but also their predicates. For Quine, the predicates gives us the ideology rather than the ontology, but the predicates are important as well. When we look to truth makers, Armstrong says, the subject, the objects and the predicates start as equals. In a sense, there is a dependence between choosing the predicates, so the vocabulary, and choosing the domain. My final conclusion, indeed, formal ontology gives us a useful criterion to afford a crucial problem for computational ontology, deciding the domain of discourse. Making truth makers explicit certainly improves the explanatory value of ontologies, although I do not claim this is enough for a full explanatory power, okay? To really work on the explanatory power, you need to work on the notion of grounding, which is a bit different from truth making, but this is another story. Indeed, in some cases, weak truth makers are trivial, not very informative. Class is fragile because of its fragility. This is not very very informative. But indeed, in other cases, they really mean something, revealing the internal structure of a relationship. For sure, marriage means mutual commitment. And so this analysis shows what is within the relation. In any case, for descriptive properties, we truth makers appear to have more explanatory power than strong truth makers. So it is good to have both of them. That's it. That's enough for today.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So now, are there any questions?
Yes, I have some, Kenneth. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Todd?
Yes. Hi, Nicola. Thank you for your talk. They're always great fun to listen to, educational. I have several questions, but I'll try and keep them limited.
Okay.
When you talk about the notion of truth makers, I've always had problems with that notion. It seems to be it could be recursive, but in particular, when you talk about some of the examples you gave us, where does the notion of scale come in? So if you talked about the fragility of a glass, where does the notion of truth making stop if you want to introduce the molecular structure of that glass? And then you go down to the relations among the possible description of how you talk about the relationship between the atoms in the molecule and so on. Now, for larger things like human relationships, maybe there is a bottom, or it's well-founded, if you like, but for other situations, this notion of truth-making doesn't seem to be able to be well-founded.
Yes, I agree. It is not enough for explaining the intimate reason why the glass is fragile. I made exactly this comment in my slides. The truth makers do not help going at this fine level of details. That's why there is another notion, which is grounding, which is different from truth making, which may help in that case. Okay, so the truth makers as a tool are not apt to solve all the problems, of course. In particular, they are not apt to solve the problems you mentioned concerning the internal structure of the glass. Okay, so there is a limit.
Okay. Yeah. And one last question, because others have lots of questions. On the previous slide, you mentioned predicates. Unfortunately, my bias is mathematics. So when you use the term predicate, are you talking about unary relations?
No, they could be any arity.
Oh, okay, good. That makes it easier for me to understand. Thank you. Good to hear from you, Nicola.
Next,
So
we
this
have
is
Gary.
Gary. I have a question about possible implications for foundational ontologies. Making the relationships essential as entities, I'm wondering if that becomes important to represent in a foundational ontology, and if you've thought about that at all.
I'm not sure to what do you mean. Of course, they play a role in a foundational ontology. I don't. What is the point?
Well, among other things, and I have, of course, I haven't thought this very deeply. I can think of an ontology design pattern, which includes the idea of relationship as an important feature of binding entities and events.
Sure.
And therefore, since that becomes a possible ontology design pattern you want to use in the future, whether that then becomes important as a foundational ontology to guide people.
Yes. Of course, yes. So this analysis of relations and relationships may be of help for a foundational ontology. Obviously. I don't know if there is something I'm not capturing.
Okay. Maybe some further thought later on.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Next, we have Corey. Corey, go
Thanks,
ahead.
Nicola.
Hi.
Somewhat of a pragmatic question, where the truth makers are outside of the domain of discourse. And I'll give a specific example, dealt with entity that trades in financial instruments. The truth makers that created these financial instruments and their predicates is outside of the domain of discourse. It is unknown to them. So, I mean, a bit of an epistemological distinction. And my experience is in trying to reify all of those truth makers, let's just say they become impatient and overwhelmed with complexity, particularly if things are unpacked. So, how do you, and this is similar to the granularity question, I suppose, to a certain extent, that as we get into trying to unpack and find the truth behind everything, it becomes almost unmanageable.
Well, maybe I wasn't completely clear about the presence of the truth makers in the domain of discourse. Truth makers are there. You find them, and once you have found them, then you decide that it is good to put them in the domain of discourse. By their nature, they are independent of the domain of discourse. Okay, they are just entities existing in the world, or in the world as you conceive them, if you take a more conceptual account. So the decision to put them in the domain of discourse is an engineering decision. Okay, and indeed I have shown several patterns which are characterized by the fact that in some cases you put one truth maker, in one kind of truth maker, in other cases you put another kind of truth maker, or you put them both in the domain of discourse.
So you're accepting that the ontology that comes out of the analysis is going to be incomplete with relative to your to your analysis.
All ontologies are incomplete.
Yes, but even in terms of analysis. One other question, if I may. You said that the truth makers are events. It would seem that some truth makers are also states. Now, maybe you're equating states and events.
States are a kind of events. Okay, this is a terminological choice. Not everybody agrees on that, but for me, states are a particular kind of events. They are static events.
Okay, if you interpret it that way, then that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
John? Go ahead, John.
Okay, one issue that I'm concerned about is the problem of typical systems which have a multiplicity of different ontologies for every component of the system. Just consider an airplane or just your ordinary automobile. You have different parts of it that have totally different theories, like the ontology for your tires, your engine, the air conditioner. Every part of it has a totally different theory, different ontology, and yet you have to deal with all of them. And when you have a problem where there's a funny noise coming out of the system, you don't know which one of these many parts are causing it. And so you not only have to deal with one ontology, you have to deal with the multiplicity ontology. And when you have language, language, nor just ordinary English or Italian or anything else, you have to take your question and interpret it in terms of a very broad and general ontology, which you then specialize to the various parts as you continue your discussion. And how do you combine all these things?
Well, hi, John, by the way. Nice talking to you. Well, of course, this what you mentioned is the well-known silos problem. There is not much you can do unless you manage to construct an integrated ontology, a top-level ontology, on which you can map all the silos, all the various silos. Okay, this is a manual effort, which in some cases it has been done, but unfortunately, in a sense, I guess this is a statement by Barry Smith, who says ontology initially have born with the purpose of integrating information systems and so on, but actually there are so many of them. The problem is still there because you need to integrate them. So my talk was not related to this problem, of course. Okay, although I believe that using formal notions taken from philosophy, like the notion of truthmaking, may help developing these integrated ontologies, which may attempt to address the silos problem.
Okay, John?
So this is Gary again. We do have a session or track coming up on interoperability, so this is important for that track coming up soon. I just wonder if you would agree, Nicola, that the idea of unpacking should help integrate these disparate ontologies. That is to say, they're not suitably unpacked, and you can unpack to a degree that they should be able to integrate more easily.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes, unpacking reveals the nature of the notions you are dealing with, okay? And maybe you realize that, for instance, a particular relationship is not, despite having the same name as something else in another ontology, indeed has a different structure, is based on different assumptions, has different truth makers. So analyzing truth makers, of course, it is not the ultimate tool. It is just one tool, but it is a useful tool for asking yourself what is the nature of this predicate you are dealing with.
I guess I would just make one other connection is that for a human, a lot of this information is background knowledge to us that sometimes gets evoked, but it takes a while. And so what we're trying to talk about here in part is evoking enough of this background knowledge and formalizing it, which is sort of the knowledge soup idea that John Sower has talked about in the past.
Yes.
Yeah, well, one of the things that many systems do is to have a very general ontology, a rather vague ontology at the top level. And the top level is usually has concepts that are not really very detailed, so that they apply to a broad range of things. And then by means of a discussion, using ordinary language, which you then try to carry out a dialogue that and brings it down to some specific topic, so that then you get to the more detailed sub-ontologies, so that you have an entire family of specialized ontologies or sub-ontologies, part of the thing for that particular topic, and which has a very precise set of concepts and truth makers of the kind that you were discussing. But then at the top level, you need to have some very general methods for interpreting language and carrying on a dialogue, so that the person that's talking and dealing with the system can narrow it down to the specific issue that needs to be dealt with.
Yes, having at the top level a general ontology is definitely useful. I would disagree if you say vague. I'd say general, yes, vague, not. And indeed, and these general notions should be well defined, not vague at all. They must be carefully defined in order to be used when you establish some discussion, as you said, there is some process of clarification of the meaning, the intended meaning of a particular term down in the domain-specific ontology. Understanding this meaning, in order to understand this meaning, you need crisp notions, like a rigorous notion of part, for instance, or a rigorous notion of dependence, and so on, while using these notions, which are very general but not vague. You can disentangle, so to speak, the meaning of the terms adopted in more specific ontologies. This is my view, at least.
Well,
So I agree with you on the general notion, on the fact that these ontologies should be general. I disagree on the term vague.
Okay, the word vague was perhaps a poor choice, but the point is that you have, when you're dealing with questions that come in ordinary language, each word has multiple meanings and a broad range of meanings, and in part of the discussion, you narrow down the meanings to determine which particular theory, sub-theory, or module is applicable to the thing. So that in ordinary language, every word has, if you look at it in your ordinary dictionary, every word has multiple meanings, and there's a lot of, and in fact, a broad range of meanings, and somehow you have to carry on a dialogue that determines which particular specialty you're talking about, so that when you're trying to repair your car or your airplane or whatever else, you have to narrow it down so that you determine which particular component seems to be the one that's causing the problem and what do you have to do to fix it.
I agree on the idea of dialogue. This is very powerful. Indeed, in the past, there have been attempts to adopt this idea of dialogue for disambiguating meaning. For instance, I remember several years ago there was some piece of software trying to ask questions related to OntoClean to disambiguate the meaning of terms. So dialogue it may be very useful in this sense. But the point is that this dialogue should use as a tool some general notions which are understandable by everybody. This is the point. The primitives, the communication primitives should be well chosen. Otherwise, you end up in continuous misunderstandings. Okay, the primitives for the dialogue should be well chosen.
Well, an example of at a top level, I'm thinking of WordNet. Now, WordNet was never designed for formal ontology. It was designed for language understanding and dealing with conversations. And you need something like WordNet, which is a very broad range, and it deals with words at the level that you might find them in an ordinary dictionary. And you would use something like that to interpret the language so that then you can narrow it down to what particular specialized ontology you're dealing with to solve your particular problem.
Yes.
Well, so this is Gary again. I had a sort of a thought, maybe you could comment on this idea of narrowing down from a more general concept. Along the way, you talked about contingent relationship. That the contingency might be one of the intellectual mechanisms we might use to do this narrowing down from a general to something that is then understandable.
Yes. What is the question?
Okay.
Yes.
The question was whether you'd explore the idea of this the notion of contingency within relationships, so that as a way of narrowing things down to be more understandable.
Let's say what's important is distinguish what is contingent from what is not contingent. Okay, and then contingent things are typically those that you have to focus. For instance, speaking of truthmakers, it is okay for necessary propositions. Who cares? Okay, the idea of truthmaking is not very informative. It is informative for contingent propositions.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking of a complex social relationship, such as marriage, which might have different contingencies in different cultures.
Different meanings, you mean?
Well, that would be another way of describing it, yes.
Okay, sure. And the point is in a sense, capturing, having a place in your ontology to point to these meaning components, so to speak. And that's why, concerning this example, I find Giancarlo's idea of relators pretty powerful, because relators are exactly the place where you put all these meaning components for a relationship.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're running a little over, so I think we're going to have to adjourn soon. So we are at the end of the track, the Foundations and Tools track. I want to thank Nicola and all the participants, and also the other speakers who are in the track. Next week, we're going to have a synthesis panel for the first two tracks. So all of the ontologies in AI, as well as foundations and tools. And I would invite everyone to come to the session next week, where I hope we can have a spirited discussion about all of the issues that have come up. Nicola, is there a chance you could come next week?
I don't know. I'll check.
Okay. But anyway, after that, we're going to have two more tracks, one on interoperability, which the discussion today actually already started to consider. And then we will have a track on education, training, and certification. And finally, one session where John Sawa and Aaron Majumdar are going to be speaking. And then that will conclude our summit tracks. So thanks to everyone. And with that, I will adjourn the meeting, and looking forward to seeing everyone next week.